Hello everyone, and welcome to the Major Tech Fails podcast, or should we say, how not to make major tech fails. And we're sponsored by RiseNow and powered by Procurious. I'm Helen Mackenzie, Principal Advisor at Procurious, and with me today is Matt Stewart. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Helen. It's good to be with you.
Now, for this episode, we're joined today by Stephanie Hoyt, who's a management consultant at RiseNow. And Stephanie, you've done consultancy for a number of years. What do you enjoy most about the consulting space?
I think I just enjoy solving problems. I've always kind of had, I don't want to say a passion for it, but maybe that's the best word. I majored in math for a while in college, so consulting is really the perfect profession for me because there's never a shortage of problems to solve. And that's probably why I focus on solution design and implementations too, because those each come with about 1,000 problems to solve, all packaged into one little bundle.
Wow, that's some amount of problems, isn't it? What have you learned from that experience?
So I've learned quite a bit, but probably the biggest problems to solve that we've identified over the years relate to users and the post-implementation support. So how are you preparing the individuals for the system and process changes that come along with a big implementation? What organization do you need to set up to support those changes going forward? And if you don't solve for those two things, it's unlikely you're going to meet the objectives laid out for the project, and the project ultimately could fail. So I really enjoy focusing on the change management side of the problem solving. And I think that's why I enjoy working with RiseNow. I like, the approach that we take to working with clients is a little bit different than a typical engagement. But also there's a strong recognition that you need to focus on both the tactical implementation problems, which is, creating the right interface and building the right process and making the right tweaks and configurations in the system, but also those overarching problems that will impact long-term success. Because we can't stress enough, ensuring a project is successful long-term requires a much different focus than just meeting a launch date.
Well, Stephanie, it's obvious from the energy that you've brought to that answer that you really enjoy that change management work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you in the podcast today about what it takes to make a project success. So it's great to have you on the episode today. And that introduction to Stephanie leads us nicely into today's episode. We're delving into why it's so important to get your CEO to fall in love with your tech. Now, I just love my new MacBook Air. I'm just besotted with the feel of the keyboard beneath my fingers. And Stephanie, what's the one piece of tech that you're wrapped with?
I just recently upgraded my iPhone, which was 5 years old. So this is probably only new to me. Other people have probably been experiencing this for years, but having iMessages to my phone that pop up on the Mac when I'm working, because I have an iMac as well, it just makes it so quick and easy to respond to text messages, and I'm notoriously bad at responding to messages. So my family and friends have been pretty happy with the change for me.
Well, that's great. So you're in their good books then. What about you, Matt? What's your favourite piece of tech?
I believe we have a theme here, Helen. My favorite tech right now is actually my brand new 16-inch MacBook Pro. I actually went away from Mac after 8 years of being a loyal Mac user. And for the past 2 years, I tried to make a go of it with my PC, as my company had standardized on PC across our organization. But during that time, I just missed my Mac too much and ended up switching back just here recently and just absolutely loving my MacBook Pro. And actually, I think it's kind of funny that we all selected Apple products. Because especially when we're talking about how to fall in love with your tech and have your CEO fall in love with your tech, Steve Jobs, CEO of Apple, former CEO and founder of Apple, disrupted the tech industry. And he really did that by focusing on the end user experience. And many would say that he almost created a cult-like type following of their products. So if you want your CEO to fall in love with your tech, I believe that you're going to need to really kind of follow that same example, which is focusing on delighting your end users. But as you're going to learn more today and throughout our series of podcasts, there's much more to it than buying a slick new user interface to bring about the kind of change and the results that you want.
Well, that's a really great link to the subject of our podcast, Matt, and a good way to move us along. So, Matt, is it realistic to think that we could get a CEO involved in a tech implementation project?
Potentially in years past, I would say it may be difficult and it may be unreasonable to expect that. But today, supply chain is, for the first time in my career, 20 plus year career, for the first time, supply chain is front page news, being talked about all the way from the top, being the President of the United States, all the way on down. Supply chain is now a focus of conversation. It used to be very difficult for me to explain and share with people what it is that I do. Now it's front page news. People are talking about supply chain and supply chain issues and failures and what supply chain needs to do to step up and lead. So I think now this is a C-level discussion, bigger and better than it ever has been. And I think there's an opportunity for us to use that and leverage that to make this a C-level discussion and get the CEO engaged, get the CEO on board, and propel your project forward.
Okay, so we want to be successful and get our CEO to fall in love with our tech. And if we're thinking of a tech implementation in an organization, a bit like a relationship where it needs to be the right fit, where do people go wrong, Matt?
Well, Helen, I believe it starts early on, well before contracts are signed and the project actually gets kicked off. I believe that trouble begins in the process that many organizations go through to evaluate what technology is going to be right for them. First, there's way too much focus on what technology can and will do, and not nearly enough on that focus on how that feature function will actually be implemented and used by your end users. And this may seem small, but I see organizations experience way too many surprises during an implementation. Because what they saw in the demo stage turns out to be different than what they expect when it comes to implementation. They may have checked the box for the solution having, such and such functionality, but then they're surprised that it doesn't work exactly like they wanted. And when it comes to users adopting your technology, it's how that functionality is delivered that's going to make the most impact. And depending on the platform, it can vary greatly from one solution to the other. So you really need to go deeper than a traditional RFP and demo to determine best fit for your organization. And don't underestimate the need for effective change management, as we'll talk about today, to really help your end users embrace the change that's coming. And I just see way too many organizations decide that they just don't need change management, or they may have the wrong person who's leading it inside of their organization or an external, and then they later come to regret it.
Well, thanks for those points, Matt. So I think what I'm getting from you there is that we need to flip things from the what to the how, and you'll be sharing some more on that later in this podcast and also in the series as well, won't you?
Yes, Helen, that's correct. Many more things to come. We have a very long list of ways that we see tech implementations could go wrong that we'll cover off in future podcasts. But today, we really want to focus on ways to help your CEO fall in love with your tech.
Absolutely, Matt. And so turning to you, Stephanie, where do you think people go wrong in that change management aspect?
Well, like Matt mentioned, there's so many companies that either ignore or just underestimate that entire aspect of an implementation when you're putting in a tech solution. So you want your final solution to be as simple as possible from a user perspective. And some of the big areas that we see that are typically overlooked, one is having a change person in the design sessions to really document the impacts fully. Every single decision that's made, fully document that impact so you know how you need to address it. And it might not just be training. It might be an organizational change or a new policy that needs to be created. And really having that person, again, advocate for the user experience. And then the second thing, once you have identified your policies and procedures and actually developed them for an implementation, set up metrics to monitor compliance of those, because you can set up all the processes and procedures that you want, but if people aren't actually following them and aren't adopting the solution, you're never going to see the benefits. And then the third thing is to create a support organization for go live and on an ongoing basis. So you should be collecting and looking at data. You do this in hypercare post-implementation to address urgent issues that need to be fixed, but you also need to be doing it long-term, collecting the customer inquiries that you're getting and identifying where are your biggest areas of need, where can you create new training materials that would help support the solution ongoing, and just really proactively address those issues to keep the user experience positive. So those are the kind of details that make an implementation successful long-term, and that's really what every CEO should expect to get back from their investment, and that's what's going to make them fall in love with the tech.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is that the change management aspect, and particularly that people aspect that you've given us some great details about there, Stephanie, is an important consideration to bear in mind. Okay, some of our listeners might think that once that important decision's been made to invest in the tech, they've done the sourcing, they've got the investment package lined up, that the work in terms of managing those senior stakeholders is done. Do you think that's true, Matt?
No, it's actually not done. As we see it, it's really only the beginning. Executive alignment is key for success during and after implementation. Whether you implement the carrot approach or the stick, it's key that you have the highest ranking executive possible, communicating the right message to both end users and your suppliers. So it must be clear that this is going to be the way that we're doing business going forward. And what we see is without strong leadership from the top, many projects struggle.
Do the existing methods that we're used to using for managing a project work for a tech implementation that needs support from the CEO, Matt? I mean, are there extra steps that need to be taken?
If your tech project's something like a sourcing solution, then you really only need a head of sourcing to buy in. That's really the level that that's the level that you would need to go, and not really need to go any higher. Because if you think about it, you really have so few users involved in like a sourcing implementation or maybe even a contract solution. And it's self-contained, inside the sourcing department and contracting department. So once you get into procurement and accounts payable type solutions and other tech solutions that maybe touch all parts of the organization or operates across departments or is used in different countries, you're going to need to go as high as you can possibly go to get that executive buy-in. And we prefer CEO if at all possible. And we have an approach that we use to help get that executive level buy-in, don't we, Stephanie?
We do. We strongly recommend, and in some cases actually require, that clients undertake a success blueprint, or what some organizations call a pre-engineering study, and we do that prior to them kicking off the project.
What's involved with the success blueprint, Matt, and why would an organization want one?
The success blueprint, or what others may call a pre-engineering study, what it does is it brings forward conversations that we find typically are not had until weeks or even months into an implementation. And some of the main items that we cover off on are, we get into process flows, policies, use cases, or some call them user stories, especially those that are more complex and that are based on industry or maybe things that make their organization unique. We'll also get into critical functionality needed to support those use cases and the process flows that go with those. Data readiness, supplier readiness, both in data quality and supplier willingness to participate. We'll also go into technical architecture and data flows, which is absolutely critical, especially when you get into like multi-ERP or global organizations. And then integrations will make or break your project as well. And the more you can plan and anticipate upfront, the better. All those things help us establish realistic resource requirements and timelines, and the ability to anticipate issues that are likely to occur in the implementation. Allows you to plan in advance and prevent delays and cost overrun situations. And Stephanie, what do you typically cover with our clients during a blueprint or pre-engineering study?
Well, the main thing we do during the blueprint study from a change management perspective is just to listen intently. So when we're going through, the design, it's not a full design session, but kind of identifying what the design decisions could look like in a full implementation. So one of the things we deliver is a high-level change impact analysis. So you can see what are the big changes and which groups are those changes going to impact. So listening for those and documenting those during the functional and technical discussions. We want to assess if the client has any existing training team or corporate communication structure in place, because that makes a really big difference in the resources that may be needed to allocate to the change management effort to ensure a smooth rollout. We also focus on lessons learned from other big projects from a change perspective. So what worked well and what didn't, what communication channels were the most effective, what would they do differently in hindsight for some of their bigger similar projects. We collect as much information as we can on existing leadership teams, because those are really the focal point for the initial change effort to get that awareness at the highest levels. So what leadership teams can we identify? Again, looking at the impacted teams and other stakeholder groups, so we really understand, the scope of the change. How many people are we really impacting, and how big is that change management effort going to be? And then finally, we try to get a jump on any potential obstacles or resistance. So what teams are going to be a challenge? A lot of times we see sales organizations, they can kind of have their own way of doing things. They don't really adhere to the corporate model, so we have to develop special materials for those types of groups, identifying those groups that are going to be more difficult up front. And that could be even individuals within leadership. It could be unions or works councils. Do certain organizations within the company command more power and resist change? Things like that. So identifying those up front, again, really helps us get a better picture of what that whole change management effort will entail, so we can plan the resources.
And I like that idea of really getting to the bottom of the people involved in the whole process and identifying, at every level where they are, and really getting into the issues that might prove challenging throughout the process. And looking at that very detailed process, Matt, would that also include the business case and the return on investment?
Yes, and it's not only the business case, but we also complete a total cost of ownership assessment. So we'll get in and we'll explore all sources of cost savings associated with the project and all aspects of costs. We can do that through a 5-year or a 10-year, whichever time frame our client requires. And based on our experience implementing over 200 some cloud-based source-to-pay and P2P systems, we get a really good feel for what it's going to take to be successful, where the value is going to be derived, what it will all cost. And based on our experience, we know the questions that come from CFOs who typically sign off on these projects, and others from the C-suite that typically are involved in approving or rejecting these projects as well. And we really help our clients prepare for anything that could be thrown their way. So by the time our executive walks in to do their presentation, they're confident. We've educated them on all the information that Stephanie and I've shared today, and they're ready. And in fact, on these engagements, one of our key definitions of success for our team is that our executive sponsor goes in and gets their project approved the first time that they present. Because we all know that they may not be given a second chance, especially in today's market climate.
And I think that I'd love to be that prepared going into such a big meeting with a senior stakeholder. So thanks to you both for that description of what's a really comprehensive way to look at things and to manage those senior stakeholders. Now, while we know that some CEOs like to take some risks with technology, but many would rather take a cautious approach, I guess we're now moving into that side on the risk, and it's falling back on us really to show how we're planning to mitigate it. How do we go about that, Matt? Are there some times where risk is inevitable and we just need to frame this up to our CEO and our senior stakeholders?
Well, another component of this process that I failed to mention is we undertake a fit gap analysis to eliminate any potential surprises that might arise during implementation. We capture potential areas that would normally be surprises during an implementation and really put a spotlight on them early on. That way we can mitigate project risk by identifying potential solutions early on and then get them to sign off on those potential solutions. It also gives us more time to deal with them when we can uncover them prior to kicking the project off. We can also weigh our options and have time to decide on the best course of action. Typically, the best option is to re-engineer your existing process. This option can be difficult depending upon your organization's appetite for taking on change, as it may require some process redesign, which usually requires more change management. Another option that we look at is to see if there's an acceptable workaround that could be put in place that would be acceptable to the organization. In last resort, if those two don't work, is we may need to go to the software vendor and add a feature request and see if they'll sign up to add that into their future roadmap. Now, all the solutions that I just mentioned, may have some pain associated with them, but if we can identify and plan for it well in advance, we can implement successfully. The challenge that we run into is when the surprise is identified during the implementation. That's where we see the most issues.
Yeah, and to add to Matt's point from a change perspective on getting ahead of issues before they become issues, if we know a particular change, as he mentioned, is going to cause pain, how much effort is it going to take to mitigate that? What resistance are we going to anticipate? How do we get ahead of it? And giving us a much better view of that allows you to have a realistic cost and resource estimate up front.
And what are the best strategies you've seen to address that sort of resistance then?
Well, to avoid resistance, first, the key is to keep the message positive. So CEOs are obviously very busy people. They want to focus on their job. They don't want unnecessary distractions. So keeping those negative sentiments away will keep the CEO confident in the project. And honestly, what keeps the CEO happy is not having to get involved in the details of a project like this and knowing that, they can trust the project team to execute. The second, we look at every issue as more of an opportunity than an issue. So even with the best planning, there's always going to be something unexpected that arises in the course of a project. So what's important is that you can actively manage those obstacles by turning them into opportunities for improvement and change instead of leaving them as, an opportunity for people to reflect negatively on the project or the functionality and express their discontent. And then finally, the reality is that, with big projects, there's going to come large changes and resistance is inevitable. So you could have that resistance within your team. You could have it outside of the team. It can come from the C-level on the production line. You have to identify it where it is, really determine what is it that resistant party needs and find a way to give it to them within reason, obviously, but maybe it's just a seat at the table. Maybe they just want more frequent communication because they don't feel like they've been in the loop on prior projects. Maybe they want to be included in testing so they can preview the system and make sure it meets their specific needs. Maybe they want someone local to support them. Maybe they just want some face-to-face time. But the key is to turn that negativity into effective engagement and keep all that chatter from bubbling up to the CEO, all that negativity. So really turning your biggest detractor into your biggest champion.
Excellent. That's some really interesting strategies to use for identifying the risk and also addressing that resistance that is inevitable but is not an obstacle that we can't overcome by being proactive and using those strategies that you've outlined to us, Stephanie. Okay, we're coming to an end of the podcast now, and let's bring this to life a bit for our listeners. Stephanie, tell us about a time where a CEO really got on board during the implementation, and how did that work in a positive way?
Well, when you have a CEO that's engaged in a positive way with your project, it's much more likely that you're going to get a positive result. So when the CEO cares, their direct reports care, and that has a way of filtering down through the organization. So it's a big morale booster for the project team, knowing that company leadership and the CEO specifically is on board and values your project. And it really keeps people motivated to continue working towards the goals because projects are hard. It's a lot of work, and usually there's extra hours and stresses and deadlines involved. So really having that support from the top makes a huge difference. That Fortune 200 CEO that I mentioned earlier makes it a point to actually come to project meetings a couple times a year. So they show their support by presenting a little bit and then really taking questions from the team and just really staying engaged and doing everything that they can to support the project. So that's rare, but it has a really big impact. Of course, in that case, the CEO is happy with the status of the project because during this engagement, we've done all the things that Matt and I have been talking about, pre-engineering studies and business cases. So we do feel like there was a realistic expectation, and we're delivering on that expectation. So I would say if there wasn't as much upfront work put into the project and we didn't have a strong change team in place, maybe the CEO wouldn't be as likely to visit. But so far, the project's going well and it's really making a big difference. And you can see it throughout the organization at all levels, the impact that has when you have the support from the top.
Well, thanks very much for that. That's a really great story of a tech implementation where the CEO was supported and on board to end the podcast with. Thanks very much to Matt Stewart and Stephanie Hoyt from RiseNow for joining me today. It's been great to chat to you, and I've no doubt that listeners have gained a lot of so many really good takeaways in your description of how you go about things. And for me, to summarise, I think they would be to plan ahead and make sure that you include change management in that planning, think long term, and share your successes. Would you agree, Stephanie?
I agree. If you do the work up front and you get realistic estimates of the plan so you can meet your goals, include change management, not just for go live, but long term. If you're successful in 5 years, that really should be your measure of success. If your users are still happy, you've achieved the long-term goals and the ROI for the project. Make sure that you share success, measure the things that matter, and show the CEO the return on the investment.
Well, thanks very much for that, Stephanie, and thank you so much for your contribution today. And Matt, there's a number of other episodes in our podcast series that we'll be sharing with listeners over the next few months. And one of those episodes is how to get suppliers on board with our tech implementation. Can you give a sneaky preview to what we're going to be covering in that podcast?
Absolutely, Helen. Getting suppliers to adopt your tech is absolutely critical. And in one of our future sessions, we're going to be sharing how to get your suppliers on board with your new tech. And no matter if you're planning to implement or have already implemented, you won't want to miss what we have to say about what you can do to make sure that you achieve the highest adoption possible with your new solution.
Okay, listeners, and that information is available on one of the other episodes in our podcast series that's about getting suppliers on board. So it's time to wrap up today, and for me to say thanks very much to Matt and Stephanie for joining me on the podcast. Enjoy your day, everyone. I'm off to type a few more podcast questions on my lovely MacBook keyboard. I'm Helen McKenzie. You've been listening to the Major Tech Fails podcast series, sponsored by RiseNow and powered by Procurious. Don't forget to head on over to Procurious at procurious.com and join the conversation with our network of procurement and supply chain professionals. I'll see you there.